morning, students. We will continue our study in the world of modern world architecture. And as you might have noticed in my previous presentations, that I am not going through this whole structure in a chronological sequence, that I have talked about the 1880s and then talked about 1890s and the 1950s and so on and so forth. You would have seen in my presentation that I switch from an early period to a later period to try to connect certain conceptual thoughts and ideas of an older work with a modern work and try to draw up a relationship between the two of them. So what I am trying to do by going to and fro like this is, in a sense, an invisible tapestry of architectural work is getting stitched together, and hopefully when we come to the end of this course, we will be able to see this tapestry made whole, completely whole, and all the connections will become clear to you. Another reason is that if I keep on focusing on one segment or one generation, some of you might start getting bored, because let's accept it, we want to see some sleek glass and steel buildings also once in a while. So retaining that in the overall presentation and connecting the old with the new, I desire to maintain that connection with you when I speak. Today we will start looking at the work of one of the greatest modern architects of our time. When I ask your generation, who do you think is the greatest architect of the modern times? You will think for a moment and say Zaha Hadid or Rel Koolhaas or Frank Gehry. You will think of these names because these are the architects that you have grown up with. As you grew up, entered the College of Architecture, these were the architects that were being talked about. When I was growing up, way back in the 80s, the architects being talked about were not alive then, but had a profound impact on modern architecture, and they were architects like Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, Alvar Aalto, and Frank Lloyd Wright. In fact, Frank Lloyd Wright was even a generation older than these people, but he had given us certain principles of design that are adhered to by all modern buildings today. Giving a simple example, if you talk about the free-flowing plan in buildings, this idea was first propounded by Frank Lloyd Wright. He got it from a more traditional source, and I'll talk about that, and he then interpreted that in a modern way for modern architecture of our times. Frank Lloyd Wright's contribution has been amazing. Unfortunately, his generation, or when he was, is very far removed from your generation in the 21st century, and that is why the link is not easy. So I re-established the link, and I remind you again that this man Frank Lloyd Wright was and continues to be one of the greatest architects of our modern times. Frank Lloyd Wright was a great pioneer. The more you dig into him, the more you read about him, you get such a vast wealth of information that one person, I, will not be able to do justice to that. In part, he was not just an architect and self-trained architect, having never gone to a formal school of architecture. In part, a civil engineer, having done limited years of course in civil engineering in the University of Wisconsin and never completing it, and in spite of that being a terrific structural engineer, an amazing architect, a tremendous understander of space, and he was also an artist in his own right because of the way he put together art pieces or collected art things. So he is not just an art collector, but he is a connoisseur of good art. He was born on 8th June 1869 and died in 1959. His working lifespan 1889 to 1959 for about 70 years, and over that period he designed over 1,000 building projects. Not all of them were executed, and the reason is that some of them could not be executed because they were too far-fetched. Some of them could not be executed because though they could be doable, the technology to build them was not available at the time. He initially studied civil engineering in the University of Wisconsin, as I told you, for less than 2 years and left it. The house that you see here in this slide is the most famous house made by him, the most famous house of the 20th century, called Fallingwater. I know there is hardly any student of architecture or teacher of architecture out there who has not heard the name Fallingwater. Now he built many projects. He built projects which were called as the Prairie Houses. The first bulk of houses he made in Wisconsin. He made that in the prairie landscape area of Wisconsin in the state of Illinois, and these were called the Prairie Houses. And the example you have here in the far in the top corner here is this house is the Robie House. Then he went on to try his hand in making houses with concrete blocks, and you have the concrete block Enos House in Los Angeles in 1923. He later on went on to experiment to try to build the house for the common man that who could not afford a very big budget, and he came up with the idea of the Usonian house. What it was, what does the meaning of Usonian, we'll come back to that later. And this house, the Kentuck Knob in Pennsylvania in 1956, followed by his last years when his houses were very organic in form and shape, the Norman Likes House in Arizona in 1967. Then he built bigger projects. He built two schools of architecture, Tillyson West and Tillyson East, where he actually admitted students to teach them the course of architecture. But of course, they were taught in his own very quirky and a very special Frank Lloyd Wrightian way. And there are certain Indian people who had worked with him and came back to practice in India, to name a few, Nari Gandhi and Mr. M.M. Rana. They were all a pass out of the Tillyson school. So he had Tillyson Spring Green in Wisconsin. This is the one, surrounded by lush green landscape and water and a very green area, versus exactly opposite in a desert area, Tillyson West in Arizona in 1937. And the amazing part is, both these buildings, the one made in this lush green landscape, the one made in the desert, just seem to merge with the landscape, and we'll talk about it later. Then there was the Unity Temple, a full mass of brick that he shaped into this bi-nuclear plant building called the Unity Temple. And then of course there was the series of cantilevered balconies just juxtaposed together and connected with free flowing spaces, the Fallingwater in 1936, his most famous project. He also built taller buildings, though he was not in favor of them, but there were some initiatives he took, like the Price Tower in Oklahoma in 1956, the Johnson Wax headquarters building in Wisconsin in 1939, along with the entire Johnson Wax complex, the Marin County Civic Center in California, a big project in 1962, and then his summation of all his works. In the end, while doing his work, he passed away. It was the Guggenheim Museum in New York. Lloyd Wright stands as a testimony to the greatness of the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, often compared with by your generation more so, with the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao by Frank Gehry. Now some of the projects that he thought of, never built, have been recreated. One of the most famous of them is called the Mile High Tower. He conceived that you could theoretically make a tall building as high as 1 mile, and this is his conception of that. And then there were other projects that he conceived which could not see the light of day, but people have rendered them and brought them together to see how they would have looked had they been finished. Now, what is the impact of the Prairie Houses? The Prairie Houses led us to a new domestic architecture, a domestic architecture of horizontal lines. Horizontal lines, I'll explain to you why, of low pitched roofs and open interior spaces, predominantly meaning a free flowing plan. The impact of the Larkin building was that the innovations he brought in resulted in a very strong effect on modern office building design. This is the Larkin building. The building is no more. It was built in very dense industrial district in Buffalo, New York. The building was ultimately demolished, but the agenda was this: to innovate a modern office design building, and at so many levels he innovated it. Then innovating in structural systems. Told you that he was part civil engineer and an excellent civil engineer, or rather I should say structural engineer. And so in Fallingwater he went in for cantilevered construction, which stands still today. in the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, he brought it a very unorthodox earthquake resistant system within the building. As a result of that, the building stood firm even in a very big and massive earthquake that happened in 1923. Then the unorthodox Johnson Wax building with its mushroom shaped column, as you see here, which initially the authorities were not willing to sign on the drawing or allow him to build. So he actually got one built on site, overloaded that in front of them by a factor of way beyond the factor of safety, way beyond the load the column would ever have to carry, and it is then that the column cracked. And all the people immediately realized Wright had built something that was going to last. It was structurally fine, there was no problem with it, and they had to acknowledge it, they had to agree to allow him to build it in the Johnson Wax. Now, the Fallingwater itself has said to be a poetry of spaces and masses, rather a poetry of interlocked spaces and masses, with one of the greatest examples of organic architecture in America. What is organic architecture? I keep on saying organic architecture. Organic architecture is an architecture that has got to do with the land and with the resources, that it becomes one with them. He said, for example, a house should be off the mountain and not on the mountain. I hope you get it. The house should be not on the mountain but off the mountain. When you make a house along with the mountain landscape, make it in a manner that it becomes one with the mountainous landscape. You draw your materials from there, you draw your building material resources from there, you try to design it in a manner that it completely merges or flows with the terrain of the surrounding landscape, as much as an architect can possibly do. So organic architecture is an attempt by Frank Lloyd Wright and others who followed him in this wake, that we want to build a building that is in harmony with the natural environment and not against it, right? A lot of these things we hear about today, because we want to make buildings that are zero carbon, want to make sustainable buildings, energy efficient buildings, and carbon efficient construction. What are we really talking about? This is what we are talking about. We are exactly saying that we want to make buildings that do not destroy our natural resources, that preserve our water, for example, that preserve our land cover, for example, that do not allow too much carbon emissions that causes damage to the atmosphere. So what they were talking about empirically, what they were talking about intuitively, we are now talking about it scientifically and numerically, but the result is the same. Only thing is that now a lot of damage is already done, and we are trying to conserve, or we are trying to mitigate that damage. What at that time, if we had already begun and thinking of buildings in the manner they were talking about, we would already have made a lot of buildings which did not have a very severe environmental impact. Okay, coming back, the impact of the Guggenheim Museum. It was a continuous plastic structure, and in this he highlighted his very much loved and tested concept of plasticity and continuity. As you step inside the Guggenheim Museum, you don't start visiting a museum from some ground. You actually take an elevator, you go all the way to the top, and then you come down the ramp, and then you visualize the entire museum. So the ramp is in such a manner that it shows to you as if the exhibition or the display, there is no clear beginning and no clear ending. It's a continuous spiral. There is no clear where to begin and where to end. So there is plasticity and continuity he brought into the building. It's a building that flows in terms of light and wind in the vertical direction and flows in the horizontal direction. Here he was able to achieve movements of people in the vertical direction and in the horizontal direction, and wherever you are standing in the museum looking out, you will see the entire exhibition displayed, all the people who are watching it at different levels, you are always connected with them, the concept of plasticity and continuity. Now when we go back into the early influences on Wright, He was influenced by Japanese art and architecture, Mayan architecture, and later on by modernism. Very small beginnings, and even great architects start with common projects. He designed the Shanley House in Chicago in 1891, and his great desire was to break the box. He always wanted to break the boxiness of the house, where you have a box, you have a series of smaller boxes in it, and each opens up through a linear corridor. He did not want that. He wanted the house to be a free-flowing interior space. But when he attempted to do that in the Shanley House at a very young age, he was not successful. And so when you see in the Shanley House, there is an attempt made. He has created a hall big enough. He has connected it with these two large spaces, but the box pretty much remains the box. Then the Japanese influence came. If you see, he did the Shanley House in 1891, and he was searching for something that would lead him towards this breaking the box concept, and that something happened. In 1893, there was a World Columbian exhibition in Chicago, and in that exhibition was displayed a Wooden temple of the Japanese. This completely transformed Wright, completely fascinated him when he saw it, and through this he was able to transform the whole idea of residential design of houses in America by focusing on Japanese principles versus the prevailing Western formula of boxes versus what the Japanese were doing. This is what the Japanese were doing. This is the interior, the plan of the Wooden temple and the interiors. You can see the plan. It's completely free flowing, and it can easily be cut off by partitions if one wants to make smaller private spaces. This is the example of a partition, but you can have a larger space if you want. So there is a tremendous amount of flexibility, tremendously easy flow of light and air through the building. The partitions are there to cut it off into smaller parts or smaller rooms if need be, otherwise that fluidity remains. The other thing is that the entire design in this case is based on the size of the Japanese mat called the tatami, and that governs the size of the house itself. So Wright was able to understand the concept of Japanese architecture, and its first appearance happened in the Winslow House just 2 years later from the Shanley House. So you see it like this: Shanley House 1891, he sees the exhibition in 1893, and in 1893 he gets the commission to design the Winslow House in Oak Park, Illinois. For a very rich man, he designs the house, but he is not able to break the box again. He fails. He attempts. So if you watch carefully, there is this space here that is opening up towards the bay window. There is a connection with this space and this space. They seem to have certain fluidity, but when you start going into the interior of the houses, you realize things just start falling apart. So much so that there is a complete contrast between the front and the rear facade of the building. You see as if you are looking at two different buildings. This is the front, which is very, very strongly symmetrical along the central axis, and then you see the rear, and all hell breaks loose. Every conceivable geometrical feature, there is a cylindrical feature, there is an octagonal prismal feature, there is a pitched roof. All of them are coming together in the rear. Thus there is a strong symmetry in the front, very strong, and a collection of forms in the rear. But let us not criticize Wright too much. Which one of us has not failed in our first attempts? At least he was trying. He was learning by making a mistake. It is said that Edison was told that you have failed in making the light bulb 1,000 times. Edison said, I have not failed 1,000 times in making the light bulb. I have found 1,000 ways how not to make the light bulb. So what Wright was doing was, through all these experiments, he was learning how to break the box correctly. And in each exercise, I believe he was learning where he was going wrong. No doubt that these houses in themselves were good houses. They were still uniquely different from the other houses. Some of the ideas were different, like the height of the building, the way that he perceived it in a flat prairie landscape, that idea was here. But if we go on forward, other than this, In the early Winslow houses, we also find the decorative work of Louis Sullivan. As I have told you earlier, Sullivan was connected with the Art Nouveau movement, arts and crafts, and he brought that kind of decoration in his tall buildings. So, and because Wright worked with Sullivan, so he was impacted by Sullivan, he brought in that artwork into his buildings, and there was a connection of the arts and crafts movement in the woodwork of Wright's buildings. See, Wright was the total designer. He just wouldn't design the house, design the furniture, design where to place the painting. All details were worked out by him as the architect. So, these ideas of the arts and crafts movement, etc., were also carried over into the early houses. So, we find the evidence here. With regard to decoration, we see in the Art Nouveau style grille work in the work of F.L. Wright, and in the furniture we find the arts and crafts movement style, that of people under the arts and crafts movement like William Morris, etc., and their furniture was highlighted here. So, the breaking the box from complex boxy interiors into spacious and fluid spaces, he began to solve that problem by first making it a cross plan, a cruciform plan, and that he attempted in the Willits House. He designed this so-called cruciform plan. As a result of this, now if you watch carefully, this is the central area which has got the fireplace also, and now the space flows on the side and goes into the back region. In this case, flows and goes into the dining area here, flows and goes to the kitchen area here. It does that without the need of barriers like doors, etc. So, now there is a certain fluidity in the entire space. He is able to achieve that, he is able to allow that kind of flow happening in the building, and this is an idea he has borrowed from the Wood End Temple, but he could not achieve that so much in the Winslow House. So, the cruciform plan is in the Winslow House, and this is a moving up from cruciform plan we find in the Willits House. So, we find here the cruciform Willits House. We have moved forward from the Winslow House to the Willits House in creating the cruciform plan. Again, this is an example of a traditional Japanese house. This is a traditional Japanese house, and we have compared that with the Prairie House. I have compared it with the Robie House, which I will show you, to show the free flowing interiors that had come into the work of Wright. So, this is the free flowing interior. These are the two examples of Japanese house, and then we have this and this as example of the free flowing house, which is the Robie House. So, we see these new concepts coming in. When it came to the free flowing plan, he attempted it in the Winslow House, he pioneered it, but only this much he could bring about that fluidity. When he did that in the Willits, much of the house was made fluid and the open plan movement in which people could just flow from one place to another. And whereas when we come to the Robie House, the entire floor plate here with the living and the dining is completely flowing one into the other, except for the fireplace in the center, and he retained the fireplace in the center. He considered that fireplace or that hearth to be the center of every family. It provided psychologically a sense of security regarding the family that is holding them together. So, he never removed that, but he brought this idea, and thus he was able to break the box. He brought in seamless transitioning, and he brought a more organic interior movement, more fluid and open planned interior movement. And these new concepts then continued, and I have marked in yellow all those areas of any given house that he was designing in that time, each one having that fluidity, whether it was the Hartley House, extensive fluidity in the Martin House, even more so in the Conley House. Space, light, sun, they are all able to move freely in these spaces without any blockage. So, it is a free flowing plan. Now, the horizontal proportions were emphasized. Horizontal proportions, that the building is more horizontal than vertical, was emphasized through overhanging roofs, because they tended to pull your eye towards the horizon, towards the flat prairie landscape. Other than that, they also provided shade for indoor thermal comfort. The lowering of the scale was able to harmonize the building with the long and flat prairie landscape, which was his original intention. As he said, house should be off the hill. Therefore, if the landscape was completely flat as in the prairies, the house had to be off the prairie, completely low height with large overhangs. When you looked at the house, your eye should be drawn towards the horizon, towards that line, and thus feel small. The scale seems to be pulled down and not tall but flat and low horizontal like the landscape. So lowering the scale, harmonizing with long flat prairie landscape. So if you take the Winslow House here and an ordinary house of that period that was built, you see this is what happened. In the Winslow House, these are two stories. The one story that he has made, what he did was, this coping that he has provided, this band that he has provided, he built it, made it slightly higher into the floor above. I mean to say that the floor plate between the two floors would be somewhere here, right? He made it so that the window would start from this darker area. You would feel as if it is a 1.5 story house, but actually it's a complete 2-storied house. But by the way they have arranged the outer aesthetic, the way the roof has been extended on either side, the way the roof has been overhung, it's a pyramidal roof, the sense given is this is low, and it is. So you compare it with this house, this is a complete 2-storied house with maybe an attic, but it seems higher, taller, and this is what I was showing, the various lines which are all pointing towards the horizontal or the horizontal direction. Now there were other parallel houses. There was the Foursquare house, the Craftsman house, the Colonial house, the Folk Victorian house, the Tudor house. All these were being made at the time by other architects and other builders. Not Wright. Wright instead was making houses like this. The Mayor May House in Michigan in 1908 to 1909. So his houses were very different from what was being built by the others. Comes to the roofscape, again we compare it with the traditional Japanese. We see that this is the traditional Japanese composition of pitched roofscapes, and we find the same combination in the Robie House, a collection of pitched roofs, or a collection here like the collection here in this temple. Wright was so deeply influenced by the iconography, by the pictorial representation of Japanese architecture, he borrowed heavily from them. Unity between structure and natural surrounding we find in his work all across. Wherever he built, he saw to it that his house responded to the natural landscape. So whether it was the Robie House in this case, or whether it was this house called the Hillside Home School in 1902. Now in the Robie House, he was also technically very sound. To get that kind of cantilever he wanted in the balconies of the Robie House, the terraces of the Robie House, he provided 4 longitudinal welded beams. 4 longitudinal welded beams running in this direction, so that these welded beams will carry the load of the roof, and they are approximately 30 meters in length. They run through the roof, and therefore because of this he could have large overhangs as you see here, and these large overhangs not only serve to provide shade to the people standing outside, but they also again pointed you towards the horizon, towards the horizontal line, and thus lowered the scale. So when you look at the Robie House, ask this question yourself even as you are hearing this lecture. Does it look to you like a complete 2 to 2.5 storied house? It looks smaller, it looks more compact, but it's got the same amount of space, it's got the same volume and open spaces inside it. So in lowering the scale, he extended the cantilever terraces like this, like this, like this, with low story heights. Here see, he extended it constantly extended. And then he gave horizontal parapet bands. There are these bands given in concrete here, and he gave long elongated enclosures around the house. All of it to show the scale is low. He wanted his house, all people at the time, the rich people would like to have a monumental building that would show how wealthy they are and how great they have become. Right when he worked for these same millionaires, gave them a house that was unpretentious, that was just off the street and very quiet, very understated, very low key, and yet it was the beginning of a completely new movement in architecture, lowering the scale throughout he attempted to do. In the Robie House, the technical innovations are the rim was set lower than the ceiling and an enclosure lower than the ceiling, and it is an enclosure and it emphasizes horizontality. I am talking about this rim. This rim has been made lower than the ceiling of the house, and it is now being used for several purposes. There are lines running above it in the vacant space between the false ceiling and the main ceiling, and then along the ceiling, along this, he hung these Japanese globe lights with wires set into it, and the wires would be completely concealed because they are going into the backside, and vents and spaces are there in this system for moving air in the building, because in those days we are not talking about a completely new, a completely air conditioning system. Thus, in a sense, because of the way he designed this roof, it became an environmental device which would heat the building in winter and exclude flue extract through the house in summer and keep it cool, right. So, this kind of technical setup was made here through this roof feature that is provided, not only to bring in light and hang these Japanese globe lights wired on the inside, but also to be able to pull in air or to move air through the vents and spaces, to be able to heat it in winter and extract flue in summer to cool the house down. Now, the guiding principles of domestic design, he said, reduce the number of separate rooms to a minimum and altogether they should work as an enclosed space. Then he said, now this is based on a vast experience of having designed houses based on this new ideology or philosophy of free flowing plan. He came up with these principles based on that. The second is free flowing plan, so divided that light and air permeate whole everything in the house with a sense of unity. Number 3, eliminate rooms and houses as boxes. Don't box everything down. Don't have boxes, this one room a box, second room a box. Don't have it like that. All walls should not be solid load bearing walls. Now the walls are only moving screens or enclosing screens or partitions. So here was the concept he was bringing in of RCC or frame construction, that the walls would not be carrying load any longer. Then walls and ceilings and floors, one large enclosure with inner subdivisions should be there. So we make one large enclosure, that is the house with wall, ceilings and floor, and then subdivide it with these partitions. That is in a sense what he was saying. And then associate the building with the site, have human proportions, use mono materials instead of a combination of jackass materials, combination of different materials. Focus on simple palette of materials when you design. Then take care of heating, lighting and plumbing as they are integral to the building, and thankfully in the modern times we are very cautious about it. Our heating, lighting, plumbing, MEP, HVAC, all of it are very well integrated. Then furnishings should be one with the building. It should be designed using machine work, not using hand craftsmanship. He was talking about prints, he was talking about furniture that was straight line, simple, clear cut, not very intricately designed like a textile designed by a craftsman. No, he was talking about very simple straight line furniture, simple tapestry, straight line, simple upholstery, all of that was simple. This is akin to Scandinavian furniture, which is also straight line, simple geometry. And we later on see that he had a tremendous impact on those architects in Europe. This is the example of the Martin house, a very extensive house based on the organic house principles that he designed. This is a house in Utrecht in Europe, which I am putting up to show how younger architects were getting deeply influenced by Wright. Here he designed a house, the G.T. Ritwell designed a house which was completely openable. These are partitions. If you remove the partitions, this is how the plan becomes of the house. It's a completely free flowing plan in which you have the dining area, the living area for example, a nook, a corner, and then you have a staircase here connecting everything. All the spaces in the house, everything is free flowing. This was Schrader House. And then if you want privacy, then you can just push some partitions and it becomes a space for 3 or 4 rooms. Very simple. So they went ahead of what Wright had done. They continued or they borrowed or they were very impressed by the idea of free flowing plan, but they built it further with modern technology and modern understanding. Not only that, you will see in these houses, they are also using less colors. They are also trying to go towards simpler palette, but they do use very vibrant primary colors which Wright would normally avoid. And thirdly, if you find on their glass there is no grill work, something which was there in the works of Wright. Till very late he had this art nouveau and arts and crafts kind of decorative grill work in his houses, and that is not there here in the European houses built with the strong inspiration of Wright. So contemporary free flowing interiors, there are many such examples. I will start, if you look at these pictures, please go in the clockwise direction as I name them. We have the Fisher House in Pennsylvania by Louis Kahn, and in 1967 we have the High Line 23 by Neil Donari in 2009. This is the one. This is the second project. The Own House of Richard Rogers is here. Then there is the Lakeshore Drive Apartments by Mies van der Rohe and the Greenwich Street project by Winka Double Dam in 2004. So these projects, all of them in the 21st century, 1 or 2 in the 20th century, all of them exhibit the same idea of a free flowing interior. And then monomaterials. Glenn Murcutt used corrugated metal in the Simpson Lee House in Australia in 1994. Then Kengo Kuma used just wood in the Yushuhara Bridge and Museum in Japan in 2010. Tadao Ando always continues to work with exposed concrete, like we see that in the Church of Light in Japan in 1989. And then we have Peter Zumthor, who experimented and worked with stone in the Therme walls in Spain in 1996. So this is another example of borrowing from the principles of Wright, and that is the use of monochrome materials. Integration of building with furniture, another thing Wright had talked about, and it is here. Cohesion, functionality and aesthetic harmony ought to be there. We find that in the Salt Lake Institute. This is the picture of the Salt Institute. The roughness of the concrete which is unfinished with the smooth finish, polished finish of the wood. And here we have, so there is a kind of harmony, this disparate elements, very different building materials come together in such tremendous harmony in this building. And then in the Farnsworth House again you find glass and steel, and then it is connected or integrated with wood, whichever inner room spaces had to be designed. Then the TWA Flight Center, which is again using exposed concrete inside and out. Then we have Charles and Eames House by Charles Eames, and again what you find is that all the decorative work is all in harmony with the house that they have created. And finally we have the Casa Barragan in Mexico by Louis Barragan. This is an example of the various furniture and furnishings that were designed by Wright and then placed in different houses. They were table lamps, there were grill work, there were clocks, there were chairs, tables. So many of these things were designed by Wright. He was a very prolific designer. And the impact of the modern European architects on them was that if you take for example the Gale House in Illinois by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1909, and then you look at the Henny House by Robert Van Hoff in Utrecht in 1915-19, you find such a tremendous similarity between the two. We find a lot of things have been imitated. Somebody has said imitation is the highest form of flattery. So here we have it, a flattery to Wright, such a close resemblance to his work. But this impact on the European architects had a reason. You see, Wright had some very strong personal troubles in America at that time, and because of that he had to leave America. Having left America, he landed in Europe, particularly Germany, and there he was in connection with some people who wanted to wishing to publish his work. Younger architects in Europe had seen his work, were very influenced by his work, wanted to embody those kind of work or that architecture in Europe, but they had limited access to the drawings of Wright. Now Wright himself was there, and then he got along with these people and he came out with what came to be called as the Wasmuth Portfolio 1910. By God's grace, even I have 2 copies, I believe, of the Wasmuth Portfolio, which are containing the original drawings of Wright. First time these architects were able to see the drawings of Wright very clearly in the plans, and this had a great advantage in what later followed, that many younger architects started learning from Wright and imitating and bringing those ideas, and the movement that took the maximum advantage of this was called the D-style movement, that started in Europe. And so we find, for example, one person who never studied under Wright but yet had a deep impact of Wright was Mies van der Rohe. And if you look at Robie House and then you try to see the Barcelona pavilion designed by Mies van der Rohe, and you start seeing a lot of similarities in the way the whole building has been put together. Of course, in the Robie House there is no water body, and there is a water body in the Barcelona pavilion, and it is a pavilion, not a house, but the concept of freedom of movement in the interiors, the free flowing plan, the way the building forms or the boxes or the parts or building parts are juxtaposed, very similar to what Wright had done in the Robie House, and we find that here. But what we do not find is, we find a certain less ruggedness in the work of Mies van der Rohe, whereas Wright's work was more hard, solid, rugged, with Art Nouveau decoration on the windows and all that. This work of Mies van der Rohe was in sleek steel and glass. In fact, the columns were all, I think, painted, were chrome plated columns, and sheet glass was there that was used instead of a partition wall. Sheet glass was used. So it was very high class materials, travertine and different precious stones were used, water were used, and there was no ornamentation, decoration, grill work in the grills of the Barcelona pavilion. So though they were borrowing from Wright, they were not doing it blindly. They were doing it appropriate to what they thought was right. So when you see fenestrations of both the Robie House and the Barcelona pavilion, you see the difference. These are the grill work, and in Barcelona it is completely gone, it is plain glass window. So we will end here, having looked at the beginning of the works of Frank Lloyd Wright, his whole concept of an open space, open plan, free flowing interiors, and how that got impacted. Other architects started implementing them in their works, and how we ended by looking at the close relationship of the D-style architects with the works of F.L. Wright, but it was not a direct one-to-one copy. They did very intelligently, according to their need, they were able to adapt to it. Thank you so much.